And I think the appropriate place for us to begin in the discussion of the topic on civil rights is to go back and make the distinction that we made previously when we were talking about civil liberties. Because remember, we said several class meetings back that for a good chunk of early American history, the concept of civil liberties and civil rights, somebody should have said something to me. The concepts of civil liberties and civil rights were used somewhat interchangeably, but over the years, and certainly at least since the Civil War era, their meanings have become somewhat different. Okay? So as soon as this gets up to appropriate brightness, you'll be able to see that I like to encourage you to think about civil liberties as the freedoms that are guaranteed to the individual, and they take the form of negative constraints on the power of government. So all this time that we've spent in the last several class meetings talking about the right of free speech, the right of free worship, the right to privacy, and other areas that we just, don't really have time to get to in this course, but we could, and if we had, developed an entire 16-week course on civil liberties, we could talk about a number of different areas. But, we just sampled those areas. So, what do they all have in common? Well, the philosophical motivation of the Bill of Rights is that government is perceived as the threat to your right of free speech, that government is perceived as the threat to your right of free worship and your right to privacy. So when I say think about civil liberties as taking the form of negative constraints on the power of government, it is certainly appropriate to think about the Bill of Rights as a listing of your civil liberties rights, but it's also appropriate to think about the Bill of Rights essentially as a list of things that government can't do. And that's why we've said, kind of emphasized very heavily in those previous class meetings that, the opening words of the Bill of Rights are very telling, right? It begins with the phrase, Congress shall make no law. And then it lists the things that Congress shall make no law with respect to, okay? On the other hand, when we think about civil rights today, we think about the powers or privileges that are guaranteed to the individual and are protected from arbitrary removal, not only by government, but also by other individuals and institutions. So traditionally, we've thought about things like the right to vote and the right to a jury trial in criminal cases as sort of the classic examples of civil rights. But as I say, at least for the last 150 years or so, since the Civil War period, we have thought about civil rights in another context as well. That civil rights have also come to include the objectives of laws that further these and other values, most notably the value of equality. We tend to think about civil rights and equality sort of hand in hand, don't we? Right? Think about the various civil rights movements in the last 50, 60, 70 years in the United States. The Black Civil Rights Movement in the middle part of the 20th century, the women's rights movement in the 1960s and the 1970s into the current period. What was called back in the 1960s, the 1970s, the Chicano rights movement, the Native American rights movement of that period as well, and most recently, gay and lesbian rights. When you think about sort of the civil rights agendas of all of these segments of society, it's motivated by the perception that these are segments of our society that have been historically and contemporaneously systematically deprived of equality. Right? So the civil rights struggles that we think about are really the struggle to achieve equality. Right? So that's what I'm saying, that we think about civil rights and the value of equality is sort of hand in hand. But there's another aspect of it as well that I really want us to get. It's important for us as we talk about the civil rights agendas here in just a few minutes. Not only do civil rights, do we think about them hand in hand with equality, but unlike civil liberties, which suggest what the government cannot do, civil rights suggest what the government must do or provide. And I think that's an important distinction for you to understand early on. Civil rights suggest that government is going to undertake an affirmative agenda, so to speak, affirmative action, if you will, in order to promote equality in our society for those segments of society that have been historically, and as I say in many instances, contemporaneously deprived of equality. Okay? So, with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about the Constitution. Any questions about that before I move on to the Constitution? So, with apologies to those of you who may have interests in women's rights or may have interests in gay and lesbian rights or whatever particular segment of society in the struggle for equality that you may have some interest in, I am going, because of the limitation that we have on time, I am going to focus our discussion in class on the struggle for racial equality. Because, frankly, I think that's been the gut issue in American society with respect to equality. Race was the initial issue, and it continues to a large extent to be the predominant issue in the area of civil rights and equality. We'll just have to leave it to the authors of the textbook to cover, the information on women's rights and some of these other civil rights movements that they do discuss, and I think they do a pretty good job with it, as a matter of fact. Right?